Welcome to This Week in Missouri Politics. We want to jump right in with our special guest this week, Missouri Secretary of State and candidate for U.S. Senate, Jason Kander. Mr. Secretary, welcome to This Week in Missouri Politics.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate being on the show. I watched the show. Happy to be here.
Well, thanks a lot, and this is a great week to have you on because we had a really interesting editorial this week on a policy position you've had, but kind of highlighted this week when you came out against the treaty with Iran. Could you give our readers the cliff notes on it and why you're opposing it?
As a former Army intelligence officer who investigated corruption in the Afghan government, I've seen firsthand what it looks like when an unpredictable country deals with internal and external political pressure. And so I just don't believe that the United States can empower an unstable regime to be in a position to one day produce a nuclear weapon. And so, when I look at this, my perspective on it, and the reason I came out against the Iran deal months ago, is that, I feel that Iran is just simply too unstable for that. And I believe that, for me, it's about looking at it and saying, okay, we can't empower them to do that, and I don't think it's a matter of whether or not we pause it, which is what I think this deal does. It could potentially pause a nuclear program. I think we need to stop it completely. Obviously, this position has upset some of my supporters.
Sure. How far do you go to stop it completely? I mean,
Sure.
Are you committed to Iran not having a nuclear weapon, and is everything on the table to stop that?
Well, look, I think that the argument that it's this or war that some people are making is frankly a disingenuous argument. I don't think that's the case at all. I think that this should be handled at the negotiating table, and my supporters, some of them disagree with me on that. I mean, there's a group that had endorsed me that took away the endorsement, but that's not going to stop me from
the president's administration. That's pretty much their position. Is if you don't do this deal, you're looking at this or war. What is the group that you lost? I mean, I was interested in that editorial. I want to know the group that you actually lost their support of over this.
Well, the group is called Council for a Livable World, and I understand why they did it. They disagree with me on the issue, but look, you mentioned the president. The majority of my party disagree with me on this issue, but I'm not going to just fall in line because I believe that my position is the right one. I believe I'm doing what I think is right, and frankly, I think that we need more people in Congress who have done something harder in their life than run for re-election, and won't crumble under political pressure.
You're on the other side of Senator McCaskill on this. Has your phone been vibrating and going off because of that?
Senator McCaskill and I disagree on this, but I think we both believe we're doing what we think is right.
Sure. Let's talk a little bit about the campaign. How's it going? I mean, it seems like you hit it hard with a terrific video. We got to watch here on This Week in Missouri Politics earlier this year. How is things going?
Things are going great. We feel really good. As I get around the state and talk to people, Missourians agree with me that Washington is completely broken right now, and that you can't change Washington if you keep sending the same people there. And so, my record as somebody who served in the Army, who has not served in Washington, and has a record of working across the aisle, that's something that I believe we need and that Missourians believe we need in Washington.
Speaking of getting around the state, one place I've seen you in a lot is Ferguson. And one of the things the Secretary of State's office deals with is small businesses. And you've even mentioned some different ideas to maybe help actually. It seems like a lot of talk about Ferguson, a lot of very high ideas that don't change a lot of regular people's lives. Some of the small business stuff would actually seem to change a block in Ferguson for the better. If you don't mind, go through some of the small business ideas you've had and some of those your office has tried to help and work with rebuilding Ferguson.
So starting with the Ferguson specific work that we've done, I'm really proud of what our office has gotten done there. Before, during, after, since the unrest, I've spent a lot of time in Ferguson. I've spent a lot of time in North County. And what I found in talking to people there, talking to business owners, talking to folks on the ground in Ferguson, what you find is that the zero interest loans, for instance, that state government, federal government extended to folks, while they appreciate that, a lot of people aren't able to take advantage of it. And so we thought that the best thing to do was to come in with something that actually didn't have any taxpayer dollars involved, was privately funded. I worked with the Regional Business Council, I worked with North County Incorporated, and we put together a program we called Ferguson Rebuild to help businesses get back on their feet and rebuild in Ferguson. We've met our goal. We raised from really around the country as well, and we hit a $150,000 goal, and that's starting to really help people. But I believe that small business, whether it's Ferguson or the rest of the state, that's the backbone of our economy. So, for instance, this past session, I had a bipartisan piece of legislation I proposed that would have made it so that the fees that businesses pay in Missouri would actually be the lowest in the entire country. I had a Republican sponsor in the state Senate for the bill. I had the Missouri Chamber of Commerce endorsed it. Obviously, there were some politics that happened at the end of last session, and it got caught up in that. And Republicans in Jeff City always say that they want to do everything they can for business, but this is a common sense thing that they can do this coming session.
Interesting thing about that, there's a bill right now about right to work that would imprison some of the employers that you may work with this group that you've raised money for, start a business, and then lo and behold, you want to hire a specific type of workforce, and they pass right to work, and you go to jail for running your company that way. It's kind of a bizarre thing to say you're pro-business, but you want to imprison employers.
Yeah, I'm very opposed to the so-called right to work bill. And look, I think when you talk to people who are actually in business, what they say is that they want some degree of predictability from state government. They're not looking for things to just change all of a sudden because there was, an election. People need to be able to plan. So what we've focused on in our office is trying to do everything we could to create that level of predictability in that business environment. Something we've done behind the scenes, for instance, is we've made it so that just about every filing that a business does with our office can now be done online. Since we did that about a year ago, 26,000 filings have been done online with our office that before that would have had to have been done in person or with a hard copy by mail. And everywhere I go around the state, that's the sort of thing that people in business stop me and say, that's great and we appreciate it.
Isn't that the way you actually change the communities? I mean, there's a public-private partnership. We're making it easier to be in private business. And then I read about the new opening of a huge $10 million, 50-room is low-income housing, kind of tax credit finance development. Stacey Hasty did. Brian May comes. This is what a better block looks like. These are people proud to live there. It really was a part of, looked like changing the face of a community. And it was a public-private partnership working together to make that happen.
Missourians are interested, whether it's in Washington or in Jefferson City, in having people who, it's not just about working together, who will actually try to do the job, who aren't just spending every moment looking for the right political angle, but are really focused on doing the job. I think that's why we've received the momentum and the support that we have in the race for the U.S. Senate. I think it's why I was elected Secretary of State in the first place.
One national issue that's hitting home to Missouri now is a Planned Parenthood issue.
Sure.
The videos, I would think even if you truly believe abortion should be legal, it's a little cringeworthy. Now it comes out that there's pretty close ties to the University of Missouri system in this. What are your thoughts, and what did you think when you saw this controversy bubbling up in those videos at the internet?
Well, I think that it's pretty disingenuous for politicians to call for investigating Planned Parenthood and then at the same time call for defunding Planned Parenthood. I don't know what the point of investigating something is when you've already apparently reached the conclusion about it. I think that strategy proves that it's really it's an attempt to create a divisive political issue. And Planned Parenthood is responsible for helping prevent 200,000 abortions a year nationwide. Millions of women turn to them for services. And so I think it's pretty short-sighted for Congress and for the Missouri legislature to be talking about shutting that whole thing down again.
If there is a link, though, I mean, obviously that's poorly thought out on the university's part, right? I mean, there's another hospital in Columbia that they could use. It seems like as this issue is a national issue, it seems a little bit separated from Missourians. As it hits home, the General Assembly is probably going to be involved on that link.
Well, if an individual breaks the law, then that person should be punished. I don't think anybody should get special treatment.
Let's lastly, want to talk about, you've been in the military. 9/11's coming up. That'll be during the time when the show airs. Can you walk us through your personal narrative, kind of intertwines with 9/11? Can you kind of tell us a little bit about that story?
Sure. So that day, like a lot of people, it changed my life. Up until that point in my life, I had looked at the idea of joining the military as something I wanted to do, but it was sort of in that maybe I'll do this one day category. And on that day, it all changed for me. I could see the smoke from the Pentagon from my college classroom. And I decided that day that I was going to join the military and I would have a civilian career after that. I found out pretty soon after that I actually couldn't join right away. I had a knee injury, and as a result, in order to become eligible to be in the military, I had to undergo surgery and I had to go through physical therapy, so I did that. And then I had actually already been accepted to go to law school in the fall, and so recruiters told me that I should wait and become an Army lawyer, and I wouldn't have to go through tough training, and I could get higher pay, higher rank. But I didn't think that the Army needed more lawyers at that point, and so that's not what I did. I actually was one of the only grad students in my ROTC program. And so I came home, and after I came home, I became a military intelligence officer, and I was a staff intelligence officer in the 75th Division, and opposition forces platoon leader for this training support battalion in the 75th Division. And then in 2006, I volunteered to deploy to Afghanistan.
It says something about the war that is happening on 9/11 and you had some things that kept you from joining, but by the time you went through those issues, had the surgery, what was still going on, and you were in Afghanistan. I mean, were you in there with a lot of folks who were also inspired by 9/11 to be in the service?
I was. You know, I have obviously a lot of respect for the people I served with. And so, yeah, that's what happened for me, is that then in October 2006, I volunteered to deploy over there, and I was a military intelligence officer. So it was my job to investigate corruption and espionage, drug trafficking, groups and individuals that were facilitating Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And so, yeah, I worked with a lot of people who I really admire. I spent, in my job, that meant I was out there trying to figure out which bad guys were pretending to be good guys. There were people of all different backgrounds that I was working with, and I was on the streets of Kabul sometimes with 2 or 3 other soldiers dressed in street clothes, gathering intel. So it was an interesting experience, and after I came home and I trained hundreds of soldiers at Fort Leonard Wood, and I got to know, even more backgrounds and more people, a lot of which were inspired by 9/11 to join. It all really, I think, shaped my values, it shaped my life, it definitely shaped my perspective on the world. And the time that I spent in a combat zone, it pales in comparison to the contributions and the sacrifice that a lot of my fellow soldiers have made. And for me, it's always been a big motivator for me in public service, and it's probably one of the major reasons I decided to run for the U.S. Senate.
Jason Kander, thank you for your service, thank you for joining us here on This Week in Missouri Politics.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Scott. Thanks.
We'll leave you, go into our break with our opinion maker panel, and we'll leave you with this week's Missouri's economic indicators.
For more than a century, the St. Louis Carpenters Union has shaped our communities. Through trusted alliances, we deliver skilled professional craftspeople, while our business partners provide the kind of quality jobs that keep our economy humming. It's a blueprint that has worked since 1882. Turning Missouri into a right-to-work state stalls progress, wipes out jobs, and kills momentum. Right to work is wrong for everyone. Let's keep Missouri moving forward. Visit carpdc.org to learn more.
Back to This Week in Missouri Politics. Now we're joined by our opinion maker panel, starting with a rising star on the Republican caucus in Jeff City, Representative John Wiemann in St. Charles County. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Aaron Willard, Chief of Staff to Senator Ryan Silvey and a longtime veteran of Missouri politics. Good to have you back on.
Good to be here.
Collin Reischman, the managing editor of the Missouri Times, joining you this week. Collin, good to have you back.
Good to see you.
And for the first time, we have Mindy Mazur joining our opinion maker panel. Mindy, thanks so much for being here.
I am delighted to be here.
And we'll start with you, U.S. Senate race, Jason Kander. What do you think?
I think he's got a real shot. I think, obviously I have a little bit of knowledge as it comes to running a campaign against Senator Blunt, as I ran Robin Carnahan's race in 2010. But a lot has changed between now and then, and I think the dynamics are different. But some things haven't changed, and one of the things that I think hasn't changed is that voters are still frustrated with what they see as this sort of Washington culture that's completely disconnected with what they're dealing with every day. And Roy Blunt kind of embodies that. And so if you see, I've seen polls lately, he's completely underwater in terms of his favorability with Missouri voters, and I think he's in trouble.
Well, clearly they're running a great campaign. They know what they're doing on the campaign side. One thing that hasn't changed since 2010, though, is Barack Obama as President of the United States. How does he get around that? Talk about unfavorables. Those are unfavorables.
You mean how does
Missouri.
Jason Kander?
Sure.
Well, I think you can see that he is very much, even though he is a Democrat, he is already taking some stances that aren't particularly in line with the president, as he just talked with you about a few minutes ago, particularly Iran and some other things. But I also think that he's a breath of fresh air. You see that he's a hard worker, he's got a wonderful background, he's all about public service, and I think he's really going to give Senator Blunt a run for his money.
Collin Reischman, you follow this daily. Does over time, does can positions like this separate himself from the president enough to mitigate the drag he would be?
I think he has to hope that it has to. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the week that we hear the most about the Iran deal, and when we hear Claire McCaskill is for it, is exactly when Jason Kander wants it to be as clear as possible that he's not for it. He's trying to differentiate, and I think he has to hope that he gets some.
That position a while ago.
No, sure. We heard a lot about it now, just as it all kind of kicked in, and I think that's because he wants it to be as clear as possible that yes, I'm a Democrat, but I'm not like the guy who's been running the country. Because if I am, then you're not probably going to vote for me.
John Wiemann, you've worked for Senator Blunt. If you're Senator Blunt, where do you feel this race is, and do you not win this one like you won in 2010?
Well, there's no question. I think Senator Blunt is certainly going to take this race seriously. He's going to run a vigorous campaign like he always has. He's got an outstanding track record in Missouri as far as winning elections. I believe he's only lost 2 elections, statewide elections, and that's when he first ran for lieutenant governor, and then when he ran for governor in a primary election. So I think he's going to be a very strong candidate again, and he's going to prove to the voters of Missouri that he's the right man to be in the U.S. Senate.
Aaron Willard, where do you see this race at?
You know, I disagree with Mindy. I mean, I think that Senator Blunt and their team is really great. I mean, if you compare it to baseball, you know, you win a lot of games by showing up and playing hard every day, and you don't make mistakes. And their campaign team, they work hard and they don't make mistakes. I think this race is going to be a little different too, because you know, Jason has had the ability so far running in Missouri and running for down ballot races or legislative races where you kind of get to go out and you get to articulate yourself and you get to lean on your resume. And he's got a fantastic resume. But the problem is this is a federal race where they are looking at control of the U.S. Senate. And he's not going to be able to get by without the liberal voting record he had when he was in the state house. And you know, he voted against things that help small business owners. He would have voted against, you know, other provisions that would have allowed the state to stand up against the EPA or healthcare. And he did support Barack Obama when he ran for president. So I think that this race is going to be more nationalized. And I think that, you know, Jason Kander is going to have to stand on more than just his resume.
Is there something said for the fact that it seems like voters will elect somebody of a party that may not be the majority party in that state to the governorship because they're kind of in their state capital and keep an eye on them. They don't as often elect them to the U.S. Senate. Well, without an issue like an Aiken coming up.
Yeah, and that may be the case. And I think, you know, Collin, I think, had kind of mentioned it too. I mean, whatever the generic ballot is going to be in the state, I think is going to be critically important. I think the person who's really got to be the most worried about that, though, is actually people in the governor's office. You know, Chris Koster probably is the one that's going to be really worried about that. Where does that generic ballot sit? Because I think that will also have a big impact on the U.S. Senate race. You know, based on what happens for the presidential in Missouri, but then what's that carryover going to be in the gubernatorial race? So I really, you know, think that kind of the national tide is going to have a huge impact potentially on that crossover appeal in the governor's race.
Quick take, John Wiemann, how important is the national tide to this U.S. Senate race?
Oh, it's certainly going to have a lot of impact on this race. It has historically around the country. What happens at the national level certainly can affect what happens at the governor's level and certainly U.S. Senate race. So definitely going to have an impact.
Mindy, how important is that national tide to this U.S. Senate race?
There's always the threat of that, absolutely. But I do think it says something that the first national ad that came out from the National Republican Senate Committee was targeted at Kander. I think they want to try and nip that in the bud. I think they think he's a real threat.
It was a good recruit. I mean, however you slice it up. I mean, Roy Blunt would rather be running against several other Democrats than him. It was a good pull by the National Democrats.
Absolutely.
Collin Reischman, stadium funding. The Rams preseason game, last preseason game this week against the Chiefs. Now we're into the last season under what the Rams say would be their last season in St. Louis. They're making plans to build a stadium in California. The fight has hit Jeff City about will there be public money in this stadium? What happens? Do the Rams stay in St. Louis, and do they do it with public money?
I don't know that the Rams stay, and I don't know right now whether or not we build a stadium. I mean, I think there's a lot of people that would like to, but I think whether or not you'd like to doesn't really enter into the conversation. At this point, there's at least a couple $100 million that, as of right now, Governor Nixon says he wants by extending bonds. The RSA is going to extend these bonds for the Edward Jones Dome. That's money that the legislature has to approve, and they don't have to do it in House Bill 1 where they do state debt. They do it later on. It's not state debt. There's no legal obligation to fulfill that. So you have the chair and the vice chair in both chambers on budget saying we're not going to appropriate the money for those bonds. I just don't see how there's any room unless you go and negotiate with those. You can get them to backtrack, but you have so many folks who are against that. I don't know that you get that stadium.
John Wiemann, you're in the legislature. Is there public money that goes into the stadium project, and without it, do the Rams stay in St. Louis?
Well, I've talked to a lot of my colleagues, both in the urban areas and in the rural areas of Missouri, and I can tell you that pretty much the rural areas are not in favor of it. There's quite a few people in the urban areas on the western part of the state that don't support it. So, and there's some in this area that don't think it's a good idea for us to be spending taxpayer money on another stadium. So I think it's a tough position to take, to try to go back to the state and ask for them to renew bonds or to add additional financing, state financing for a public, corporate enterprise. And so I'm having a hard time seeing where this is going to happen. And I keep getting different messages too, because I've talked to folks on both sides of this, and I hear, well, don't believe what you're reading in the newspapers. There's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes.
I don't read this in the newspapers. What do you mean?
Yeah.
Who's telling you
well,
that?
not your newspaper.
They don't know.
Present company excluded,
Well,
right?
fair enough.
Right, present company excluded. But it's one of those situations where we don't really know yet. It's still evolving. There's still, the chess match is still occurring. The governor's still playing his games with. Now the latest thing is, well, if we don't vote for it, it's going to affect our bond rating. I mean, what else are we going to see that's going to come down the pike?
And Willard, you are the prime guy to have on the panel this week to talk about this issue. Senator Silvey, your boss, has been very outspoken on what he thinks. How does this play out? I know you don't agree. Do the Rams stay without public funding in a stadium?
I think it becomes really hard, and you really have to kind of look back at where some of this originated. I mean, we got to this point because of a broken down deal, an agreement that was signed with the Rams, right? I mean, that was how we got to this.
History's not judged at kindly.
Exactly. So I don't think that we can't necessarily forget that. But I am very proud that Senator Silvey, we recognized this early that this was a problem, but this is not a Kansas City versus a St. Louis issue. One of the underlying problems with this is that they're talking about bringing on a massive amount of public debt and no input from the people, and have actually gone out of their way to try to prevent people and and citizens from voting on this. And so I know one of the proposals that Senator Silvey is looking at next year is actually, okay, let's maybe craft a statewide vote and let's let the people decide on this.
Well, Mindy, we won't ask Aaron. The real question is, what would Senator Silvey think if this were the Chiefs? We'll ignore that just for 1 second.
They did this, and they took it to a local vote in Kansas City.
They had to go and get the vote locally,
Yeah.
and they ended up doing, and in St. Louis, they sued to not vote here in the city. So there is a difference in how they've been treated.
At the end of the day, does public money go in that stadium?
Well, time will tell. But I think we should give the governor credit for trying to assert his leadership and try and through administrative means do something that would economically empower the St. Louis area. I do, however, understand the concerns on the other side about if we're talking about the priorities of tax money here.
That's a forgotten part of this. That's a good point. We hear people on this show complain Nixon doesn't talk to them. He's stepped up here.
Yes, absolutely. So whether or not you agree with him, it is a strength of leadership there. Whether or not it happens, I guess we'll find out.
Last topic, right to work. Representative Wiemann, it's good. The ball is in the House's court. The right to work thing, 20 votes short, 15, something like that, on passage to override. The governor vetoes it. Does this regulation pass?
Well, as Mindy alluded to, time will tell, but I think there's certainly efforts right now to try to get that 15 or 20 votes that we were short, to have the supermajority to see that that's the right decision to support right to work, and it's good for worker freedom and fairness and equality, and getting our colleagues to understand that, those who are maybe on the initially voted against it, that this is the right thing to do. And I think that's what's being done right now.
Do you think your colleagues that voted against this regulation on employers will stick with the employers, or will they flip?
Well, I wouldn't say employers, they'd stick with the workers. I think that they need to, there's still, a lot of them are in the decision-making mode. They're still thinking this through. They're talking to both sides of the issue and trying to make a determination as to what's best for their district and their state. So it's still evolving. It's still not a done deal yet.
And Willard, at Lincoln Day, Republicans are for employers, but we're seeing in September they may be for the employees. Isn't Republican Party about cutting taxes and growing business?
Well, I think, to take a step back from that, as part of the Republican Party and as somebody who has really actively helped to get a lot of Republicans elected, I completely understand, using right to work as a tool in the tool belt to try to grow and create jobs. But I look at it from a bigger picture too, and look at the things that we would not be able to have done if we didn't have these supermajorities. And we built those supermajorities with a coalition. And to a degree, we had to build that with, one of the people that I work with. I mean, you build that from Republicans that have relationships with labor. And we wouldn't be able to, do some of the things that we've been able to accomplish without that coalition. So, I think that, the question, and I think that's a good one, because I kind of see that emerging as this right to work issue is kind of a litmus test for Republicans. I have a little trouble with that, because there's a lot of things that we've been able to do that we wouldn't have been able to have accomplished without those supermajorities that took a coalition.
Maybe a litmus test of, do you support employers running their companies like they want to, or do you want to tell them what to do? And I think that's a very fair litmus test. One, Collin Reischman, you've covered this issue extensively. Do you see this as something that happens? I mean, the speaker's racking up miles all over the state working on this. At the end of the day, it's a heck of a hill to climb, and the Republicans have lost votes in the House due to people leaving for various reasons. Is this law?
I don't see an avenue to get that many votes. It wouldn't shock me if there were more votes for right to work to override than there were when it originally passed, if they pick some up. But just yesterday, there were rumors somehow started swirling about a bunch of Jefferson County representatives were supposedly going to change their votes, and that's all, for the most part, a very pro-labor Republican area. And we reached out and talked to them, and they said that's just not true. None of them are planning on switching, and they haven't even been offered a deal. And the Speaker, Todd Richardson, said he's not planning on making any deals, at least with Jeff County folks. So I wouldn't be surprised if they got more votes. I would be very surprised if they got the 15 or 20-ish that they need to actually override. I mean, that's a huge turn, and some of these folks are folks that have sworn up, down, and sideways that they'll never vote.
I mean, it looks like the speaker's going to do all he can do. He's all over the state right now whipping votes, but I don't think he's going to do something shady to make this happen.
Well, I certainly hope not. I don't know the speaker personally, but I've heard that he's a stand-up guy, and I think he's trying to probably whip the votes. But I don't think the votes are there, and I don't think they're going to be there. The people who, for the most part, who voted against right to work voted against it because they think it's a bad economic policy for our state, and they don't want to overly prescribe the relationship between employers and unions and workers. And so I think it's a policy decision that they've made. They're on the record. And I don't think we're going to get enough people to flip to change that position.
A little hard, modern Republicans sometimes. You have some Republicans that want to cut government, cut regulations, cut taxes, and then here they want to add regulations and maybe imprison business owners. It's hard to keep up with sometimes the modern Republican Party. It jumps around a little bit, you know what I mean?
Yes, well, it's not exactly consistent, is it?
It seems a little odd. Last quick takes, the presidential race is what everyone's talking about. One quick thing, with just a few seconds left. John Wiemann, is Donald Trump in this race when voting starts in Iowa?
Oh gosh, he certainly has surprised me as how well he has done up to this point.
So you're saying he's there?
There's a possibility. I'd put it at maybe 40%.
Quick take, is he in, yes or no, Aaron Willard?
I think he's in. He's in Iowa.
When voting starts, is he in?
I think so.
Any measures he in?
Yeah.
It'll certainly be interesting if he is. And we'll have to leave that there for this week in Missouri Politics, and we'll see you next week. Talk about state issues.